She rested her hand on her boss's arm and told our friends she'd finally traded up. I smiled, said nothing, and slipped something into her purse. She had no idea the building she celebrated and was already mine. My name is Roger Merritt. I'm 54 years old, and I run the regional operations for Merritt and Sons Construction Holdings, a company my grandfather started with 2 trucks and a handshake, and my father turned into something that quietly owns more of this city's bones than most people will ever know. I don't talk about it at parties. Never have. That's just how we were raised. Renee and I met when I was 32. She was sharp, funny, full of ideas. When she told me she wanted to build an education technology company, I believed in her. I backed her, not just emotionally, but structurally. I signed paperwork she never read past the first page. I let my family's holding trust become the quiet foundation under her dream. I did it because she was my wife, and that's what you do. Or so I thought. The dinner was at the Alderton Club, one of those places where the lighting is soft and the wine list is longer than most legal briefs. It was her company's 3rd-year milestone celebration. 40 guests, open bar, Renee in a new dress she'd bought without mentioning the price. Fine. I wasn't keeping score. I was talking to Kurt, my oldest friend, known him since we were both 18 and broke and convinced we'd figure all out, when I heard the room shift. Not loud, just a change in frequency. The way a crowd goes quiet for half a second before someone says something they can't take back. Renee was standing near the head of the table. Her hand was resting on Weston Greer's forearm. Not a brush. A rest. Deliberate. Comfortable. Like she'd done it 1,000 times in private, and had simply stopped caring who saw. And then she spoke, loud enough for the whole table to catch it. Honestly, she said, tilting her head toward Weston with a smile I hadn't seen her give me in years, I don't know where this company would be without the right kind of support. She paused. The real kind. A few people laughed. A few looked at their plates. I didn't move. I just held my glass and watched her, and something cold and very steady settled in behind my ribs. Not rage. Not grief. Something more like recognition. Like finally reading the last line of a letter you'd been avoiding for months. Kurt touched my elbow. He didn't say a word. Just the pressure of 2 fingers. The oldest signal we had between us. I see it too. That was all I needed. I set my glass down. I buttoned my jacket. I walked to Renee, leaned close enough that only she could hear, and said quietly, I'll get the car. She waved me off without looking. I'll get a ride, she said. Weston was already nodding. I walked out through the lobby, past the coat check, through the glass doors, and into the cold air. I sat in my car for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I was thinking about a folder in my office. A folder with a blue tab that I hadn't opened in 2 years because I hadn't needed to. A folder that contained, among other things, the founding trust documents for a company called Harwick Structural Partners, the silent parent entity that held controlling interest in the building that housed Renee's entire operation. I thought about a clause on page 9. Then I started the engine and drove home. She didn't come back until after midnight. By then, I'd already made 1 phone call. I've never been a man who makes decisions in anger. My father drilled that into me before I was old enough to shave. React fast, and you'll spend the rest of your life cleaning up the mess. So when I got home that night, I didn't pour a drink, I didn't pace the kitchen, and I didn't call anyone except the one man I needed to call. Our family's trust attorney, Bill Crocker. 40 years in structural estate law, calm as a courtroom clock, and the only person outside of blood who knew exactly how Merritt Holdings was put together. I told him what happened at the Alderton Club. Not the emotional version, just the facts. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause, and then he said, Roger, the Harwick clause is still clean. Nothing's been reassigned. You're exactly where you need to be. I thanked him and hung up. Then I walked to my office, the real one, at the back of the house, not the shared workspace Renee had redesigned upstairs with white walls and decorative shelving that held nothing useful. I pulled open the bottom drawer of my grandfather's old oak desk and took out the blue folder. It was thicker than I remembered. Inside were the founding documents for Harwick Structural Partners, the silent holding entity my father and I had registered back when Renee's EdTech company was still a business plan on a legal pad. At the time, she'd called it her safety net. She signed everything I put in front of her, asked a few surface questions, and moved on. I remember thinking she'd circle back and read it properly. She never did. Page 9, paragraph 4. I knew it by memory, but I read it again anyway. In the event of reputational breach, marital conflict of interest, or undisclosed relationship affecting leased or funded operational zones. The managing trustee retains the right to initiate a compliance review without prior notice to the beneficiary. Clean. Legal. Filed with the state 3 years ago. I sat back in the chair. Renee's company operated out of a building whose lease ran through Harwick. Her original seed funding had been structured through a holding vehicle that answered to Merit Holdings. She had been building her empire on a foundation she never once looked down to examine. And there was one more piece she didn't know about. Walt Odom. Walt was my father's closest friend from his early development days, a quiet man from outside Columbus who had co-invested in the original Harwick structure as a personal favor when I was just getting the trust organized. Walt never asked for recognition. He showed up at the occasional closing, signed what needed signing, and went back to his life. Renee had met him once at a family barbecue and spent approximately 4 minutes talking to him before finding someone more interesting. She didn't know his name appeared on her company's founding documents as a silent co-sponsor with approval rights over major operational changes. I made a note to call Walt in the morning. I was still at the desk when I heard the front door open just past midnight. Renee's heels on the hardwood, the soft thud of her bag on the entryway table. She appeared in the doorway of the office, still dressed, still sharp-looking in that way she always was after an evening out. She looked at the folder on the desk. "Working late?" she said. "Not concerned. Just filling the air. Going over some trust documents," I said, which was true. She made a small sound, not dismissive exactly, but close, and said she was going to bed. I told her good night. She didn't kiss me. She hadn't in a while. I waited until I heard the bedroom door close. Then I opened the folder again and took out a single sheet. A filing form from the Harwick Compliance Office. Pre-signed by me, dated, ready to go. All it needed was one box checked and a fax number. I checked the box. I wrote down Bill Crocker's office number. I put in the outgoing tray and turned off the lamp. The form had been sitting ready for 3 days, pre-signed, dated, needing only that one box checked. I'd filled it out the morning after I first heard Greer's name mentioned in the same sentence as Renee's. That was 4 days before the Aldern dinner. She had no idea. Outside, the city hummed along indifferent. Somewhere across town, Weston Greer was probably still celebrating. I didn't mind. Let him enjoy it while the clock was still his. The compliance filing hit Weston Greer's world on a Tuesday morning, 48 hours after the dinner. I know the exact timing because Bill Crocker sent me a confirmation message at 9:14 a.m. 3 words. Filing acknowledged. Moving. I was at a job site in the East Quarter when it came through, watching a crew pour foundation concrete for a commercial complex we'd been contracted to build for the better part of a year. I read the message, put the phone back in my pocket, and went back to watching the pour. There was a satisfaction in that, in the solidity of it. Foundations don't lie. By noon, I heard from Kurt. He called from the parking lot of his accounting firm, voice low. "Roger, you need to know." Words already moving. 2 people from the Alderton dinner reached out to me this morning asking what your connection to Harwick was. Apparently Greer's phones have been running hot since about 8 o'clock. I told him I wasn't surprised. "There's more," Kurt said. One of the guests recorded part of the evening. Renee's comment, the arm thing. It's been circulating in a group chat. Someone on Greer's side forwarded it to a compliance officer at the Regional Real Estate Board. Apparently Greer has a pending license renewal. I let that sit for a moment. I hadn't arranged that. I hadn't needed to. Renee had done that part herself. "Just stay out of it," I told Kurt. "Let it run." By mid-afternoon, Renee called me twice. I let both go to voicemail. The 3rd time I picked up. "Roger." Her voice had that press quality, controlled but close to the edge. "Weston is getting calls from some compliance board. He says it's connected to our lease." "What did you do?" "I filed a standard trustee review," I said. "It's procedural." "It is not procedural," she snapped. "His attorney called our company's registered address this morning. My assistant is panicking." "Then you should probably talk to your own attorney," I said calmly. She went quiet for a second. "You're doing this because of the dinner." "I'm doing this," I said, "because the Harwick documents require it when there's a conflict of interest affecting a lease zone." "You created the conflict, Renee." "I just followed the paperwork." She hung up. I drove back to the office, and by the time I got there, an email had come in from Walt Odom. Walt didn't email often. He preferred the phone, so I opened it immediately. 4 lines. Formal and precise in the way Walt always was when things got serious. He had seen the filing notification through the trust's administrative system. He was in full agreement. He was available to provide co-sponsor confirmation if legal required it. He signed off with, "Your father would have done the same thing. W." I printed it and put it in the blue folder. That evening I came home to a house with the lights blazing and Renee standing in the kitchen with her phone in both hands like it was something she could squeeze answers out of. She looked up when I walked in. Her eyes were hard, but underneath that hardness was something I hadn't seen in her in years. Genuine uncertainty. "Weston lost 2 clients today," she said. I hung on my jacket. "That's between him and his clients. His attorney says the filing flagged a personal relationship disclosure failure." She set the phone down on the counter. "They're saying I should have disclosed our marriage when the lease was signed because of Harwick's connection to your family trust." "That's accurate," I said. "I didn't know about Harwick's connection to your trust." I looked at her steadily. "You signed the documents, Renee." She stared at me. Then she picked up her phone and walked out of the kitchen. I heard the door to the upstairs office close. I made myself a plate of leftovers, ate at the kitchen table, and read the evening news. Quiet and deliberate, the way my father used to sit at the end of a long day when he'd made a hard decision and was at peace with it. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into its nighttime rhythms. In Greer's part of town, I suspected the mood was considerably less settled. My son Arthur called on a Wednesday evening, 2 days after the Alderton dinner. I hadn't reached out to him yet. I was still assembling the picture myself. But Arthur had always had sharp instincts, even as a kid. He worked in network infrastructure security for a regional firm out of Indianapolis, and he had the particular habit of noticing things that didn't line up. "Dad," he said, skipping the small talk entirely, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it before you say anything." I told him to go ahead. He took a breath. "About 4 months ago, I was doing some routine consulting work for a company that uses the same cloud architecture vendor as Mom's EdTech platform. I wasn't snooping. It was a professional overlap. But I noticed irregular outbound data transfers on a shared infrastructure node. Same timestamps, recurring pattern, routed through a third-party consultant server. I was quiet. I didn't know whose it was at first. Arthur continued. "But when I looked closer, the routing address traced back to a firm called Greer Strategic Solutions." A pause. "That's Weston Greer's consulting company, Dad. He's been receiving data pulls from Mom's platform for at least 4 months. Client lists, curriculum licensing files, vendor contracts." I sat down slowly in my chair. "You're certain?" "I documented it," he said. "Timestamps, file sizes, routing logs." I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't want to come to you with something half-baked. I've been sitting on this, and after what happened at the dinner, I couldn't keep sitting on it. I felt something settle hard in my chest. Not surprise exactly. More like the last piece of a picture clicking into place and confirming the thing you'd already suspected. "Send me the documentation," I said. "Already sent. Check your secure email." Another pause. "Dad, I'm sorry I didn't come to you sooner. You came when you were sure," I said. "That's the right way." After we hung up, I sat for a long moment before checking the email. Arthur had put together a clean, thorough file, the kind of work that reflected well on the man he'd become. I forwarded it directly to Bill Crocker with one line. "Add this to the Harwick compliance package." Then I called Paige. My daughter picked up on the second ring, cautious, already sensing from my voice that this wasn't a casual check-in. Paige was 24, working in marketing for a mid-sized consumer brand in Cincinnati. She didn't have her brother's technical background, but she had something equally valuable. She could read people the way most folks read a room, fast and accurate. I told her the broad strokes. I didn't editorialize. I just laid it out, the dinner, the filing, what Arthur had found. She was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then she said, very evenly, "Mom called me this afternoon." I waited. "She said you were overreacting, that the dinner was a joke, and that you were using the trust documents to punish her." Paige paused. I let her finish. Then I said, "Mom, don't tell me anything else right now. I need to think." And I hung up. "That was the right call," I said. "I'm on your side, Dad." Her voice was steady. "But I want you to know, I'm not doing this out of anger. I'm doing it because what she did wasn't okay, and I've been watching it build for longer than that one dinner. It was the most direct thing my daughter had ever said to me about her mother. I didn't push it further. After I put the phone down, I thought about how long it had been since Arthur and Paige had spoken to each other properly. 3 years, maybe closer to 4, a falling out over a family financial matter that had more to do with misunderstanding than malice, but had hardened into distance the way these things do. And now, in the span of 48 hours, they had both called me. I didn't know if that counted as a silver lining, but I held on to it. The week after the Alderton dinner moved the way a controlled burn moves, contained, deliberate, consuming exactly what it was supposed to consume. Bill Crocker called on Thursday to confirm that the Harwick Compliance Review had been formally acknowledged by the Regional Commercial Leasing Authority. Weston Greer's license renewal had been flagged for secondary review, pending resolution of the conflict disclosure. Arthur's documentation of the data transfers had been packaged and submitted to the compliance office as supplemental evidence. Walt Odom had filed his co-sponsor confirmation in writing. Every piece was in place. I didn't tell Renee any of this. I didn't need to. She was finding out on her own, one phone call at a time. By Friday evening, the house had taken on a particular temperature. Not loud, not explosive, just charged, the way the air feels before a storm rolls in from the west. Renee had been in back-to-back calls for most of the afternoon, speaking in the clipped, careful tones of someone managing a situation she didn't fully understand yet. I made dinner. Set 2 plates. She didn't come to the table. At around 7 o'clock, she appeared in the kitchen doorway in a blazer and heels, bag over her shoulder, phone in hand. I'm meeting with Weston tonight, she said, not asking, stating. I looked at her for a moment, then nodded once. All right. She tilted her head, studying me with that expression she used when she was trying to figure out if she'd won something. You're not going to say anything? What would you like me to say? I asked. She made a short sound, half laugh, half frustration. You may as well accept it, Roger. This is just how things are now. You and I both know this marriage has been done for a long time. I'm not going to keep pretending for your comfort. I held her gaze. Calm. Steady. I'm not asking you to pretend anything. She waited another second, then turned toward the hallway. I watched her pick up her purse from the entryway table, check her phone, and head toward the front door. What she didn't do, what she never thought to do, was look inside that purse. Earlier that afternoon, while she was on a call upstairs, I had slipped a single folded document into the interior pocket of her bag. Not a threat, not a message, just a copy of the Harwick filing, specifically the page that listed her company's lease address, the conflict disclosure clause, and, at the bottom, in the clear and unremarkable font of legal documents everywhere, the name Weston Greer flagged as an undisclosed party of interest. If she opened her purse at that dinner, and she always opened her purse at dinners for a card, for a lipstick, for her phone charger, she would find it. And so would anyone sitting close enough to see. I didn't arrange what happened next. I just gave the evening a little information it didn't have before. The front door closed. I sat back down at the table and finished my dinner. At 10:43 that night, my phone rang. It wasn't Renee. It was Kurt. You're not going to believe this, he said. His voice had that tight, almost laughing quality that meant something significant had just landed. I just got off the phone with Ray Alderton. You know him, runs the Alderton Club. Apparently Greer and Renee were meeting in the private dining room tonight. One of the staff members noticed Renee pull some papers out of her purse, and Greer apparently lost his composure right there at the table. Raised his voice. Staff heard the word compliance and filing twice. I said nothing. Greer walked out. Kurt continued. Left her sitting there. Ray said Renee stayed at the table for about 20 minutes, then left without touching her food. A pause. Roger, what did you put in her purse? A copy of a document she should have read 3 years ago, I said. Kurt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Your father would have done exactly the same thing. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat in the kitchen for a while, in the quiet of a house that was finally telling the truth about itself. Renee came home just after midnight. She didn't speak. She walked past the kitchen, past the office, straight to the bedroom, and closed the door. I heard her on the phone again within minutes. Voice low and controlled. The kind of control that takes real effort to maintain. I went to the office and opened the blue folder one more time. Arthur's documentation sat on top now. Clean, organized, irrefutable. Below it, the Harwick filing. Below that, Walt Odom's written confirmation. Below that, the original lease documents bearing Renee's signature on page after page of text she'd never read. I closed the folder, turned off the lamp. Outside, the city went on doing what cities do. Somewhere across town, Weston Greer was likely on the phone with his own attorney, trying to figure out how a dinner party had turned into a compliance investigation. And somewhere in this house, Renee was starting to understand that the ground under her feet wasn't hers. It had never been hers. Saturday morning arrived gray and still. I was up at 5:30, which is my habit, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with Arthur's documentation spread out in front of me, not reviewing it. I'd been over it enough times to know it cold. Just keeping it in front of me the way you keep a map on the table when you're partway through a long drive. Renee didn't come downstairs until after 9. She was dressed, composed, carrying her coffee like a prop. She sat across from me without being invited and looked at the documents on the table. I want to talk, she said. Go ahead, I said. She folded her hands around her mug. The meeting with Weston last night fell apart. He's lawyered up. He's blaming me for the compliance filing, saying I created a conflict of interest without his knowledge. Her voice was measured, but I could hear the effort in it. And I need to know exactly what you filed, Roger. All of it. I looked at her steadily. I filed what the Harwick documents require me to file when a conflict of interest was created in a lease zone under our trust management. The conflict wasn't created by the filing, Renee. It was created the moment you stood up at that dinner and told 30 people you traded up, while your hand was on the arm of a man whose firm operates on property our family trust controls. She opened her mouth. I'm not finished, I said, quietly but firmly. Beyond the lease issue, our attorney has received documentation showing that Weston Greer's firm has been receiving data transfers from your company's platform for approximately 4 months. Client lists, vendor contracts, licensing files, routed through his consulting server. The color shifted in her face. That's a professional data share. He's a consultant. He's not listed as a consultant in any of your company's registered agreements, I said. He's listed as nothing because you never disclosed the relationship to the trust, to the co-investors, or to me. She set her mug down. You're going to use this to take everything. I'm going to let the process work, I said. That's all I've ever done. She stood up, and I could see her trying to find the angle, the argument, the leverage point that would shift the balance. She was a smart woman. That had never been the question. Walt Odom, she said suddenly. He's just a name on a page, Roger. He has no real standing. Call him, I said. She stared at me. His number is in the trust directory, I said. Call him. Tell him he has no real standing. She didn't call him. But Walt called me that afternoon, as it turned out. Not because I'd asked him to, but because he'd received a message through the trust's administrative system flagging a request to contest his co-sponsor status. Someone had contacted the trust registry questioning whether his filing was procedurally valid. Walt was 73 years old, had spent 50 years in construction development, and had the patience of a man who had watched more people make expensive mistakes than he could count. I got a query this morning from someone calling themselves a trust review specialist. Walt said over the phone, dry as a Kansas August. Wanted to know if my co-sponsor status could be reclassified as advisory only. A pause. I've been in this business since before your wife's company had a name. I know what that query means. What did you tell them? I asked. I told them to contact my attorney. Another pause. Then I called my attorney. Walt's attorney was a man named Gordon Price, who had argued cases before the state's commercial trust board for 30 years and had the reputation of someone who didn't lose on procedural matters. By the end of the weekend, Walt's co-sponsor status had been formally reaffirmed with a board confirmation letter. The attempt to quietly reclassify him had not only failed, it had created a paper trail showing that someone connected to Renee's side had attempted to interfere with the trust structure. That trail would matter later. That evening, Arthur called to check in. We talked for about 20 minutes about the documentation, about the process, about things that had nothing to do with any of this. At the end of the call, he said, "Hey, Dad, Paige and I talked today. Real talk, not just texting. First time in a while. How'd it go?" I asked. "Good," he said. "Really good, actually. A beat. We're both coming up next weekend, if that's okay." I told him it was more than okay. After I hung up, I stood at the window and watched the last of the afternoon light drain out of the sky. Something that had been clenched in my chest for years, maybe longer than I'd admitted, loosened by 1 degree. Whatever came next, I wasn't going to be standing alone when it arrived. Franklin Allgate was 76 years old and had spent most of his adult life in commercial real estate development in the Southeast. He was the kind of man who wore a press shirt on a Saturday because he saw no reason not to, who kept his handshake firm and his opinions private until he had something worth saying. Renee had her mother's looks and her father's ambition, and somewhere along the way she'd convinced herself that the ambition was entirely her own invention. Franklin had never corrected that impression. He'd let it run, the way you let a young horse run in a big field, watching, measuring, waiting to see what it would do when it hit the fence line. It hit the fence line on a Saturday morning in November. I drove to Franklin's house in the old Buckhead neighborhood, where he'd lived since before Renee and I were married. Not because I'd been asked to. I called first, and he said, "Come on by, Roger. I've been expecting you'd turn up eventually." That was Franklin. He didn't waste time pretending things weren't happening. His study was the same as I remembered. Dark wood, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a pair of leather chairs by the window that looked out over a garden he maintained himself. He poured 2 glasses of bourbon, set them on the table between us, and sat down without any preamble. "My daughter did something foolish," he said. "Yes, sir," I said. "More than once, from what I'm gathering." He picked up his glass, didn't drink yet, just held it. "The Harwick filing, I understand. The data transfers your boy found. That concerns me more." He looked at me directly. "Did she know Greer was pulling information from her platform?" "I believe she gave him access," I said. "Whether she knew the full extent of what he was doing with it, I can't say for certain." Franklin nodded slowly. "She's been talking to me about starting fresh for about 8 months. Said her company had outgrown its original structure, and she wanted to move it under new investment partners." He paused. "I told her any restructuring had to go through the existing trust agreements first. She didn't want to hear that." He finally took a sip of his bourbon. "Now I understand why." I told him about the compliance review, the data documentation, the lease flag. I didn't editorialize. I just laid out the way I'd been laying things out all week. Clean and factual, no flourish. When I finished, Franklin set his glass down. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document. He set it on the table between us and looked at it for a moment before speaking. "I hold a 12% advisory stake in Renee's company through my own private holding vehicle," he said. "The original agreement included morality clause. My attorney insisted on it years ago, and Renee thought it was ceremonial." He tapped the paper. "It is not ceremonial. Given the public conduct at the Alderton dinner and the subsequent conflict disclosures, I exercised that clause this morning." He looked up at me. "Her advisory stake has been reassigned to you, effective today, pending legal confirmation." I stared at him. "You built the foundation," Franklin said simply. "You kept your mouth shut and let her take the credit because that's who you are. I'm not going to sit here and watch a man like that get cleaned out by a process he set up in good faith." He picked up his bourbon again. "That's not how I raised my daughter to treat people, and since she seems to have forgotten it, I'll remind her another way." I didn't have words for a moment. "Franklin, don't," he said, not unkindly, just final. "You'd have done the same for your kids." He was right. I would have. We talked for another hour, about the process ahead, about what Renee might do next, about the children. When I mentioned that Arthur and Paige were coming up the following weekend, his expression shifted into something that looked close to relief. "Those two need to find their way back to each other," he said. "This family has enough fractures already." I agreed. When I stood to leave, Franklin walked me to the door. He shook my hand at the threshold, and then, in a tone so quiet I almost missed it, he said, "She had everything worth having, Roger. She just couldn't see it." He closed the door behind me. Not a slam, just a door closing. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. The morning was cool and clear, the old neighborhood quiet around me. I thought about the document Franklin had just handed me, not as a trophy, just as another piece of a picture that was finally, slowly coming into focus. Then I drove home. The following 10 days moved differently than the first week had. The first week was all signal, loud, fast, full of reaction. The second wave was quieter, which made it heavier. Renee had stopped confronting me directly. She'd moved into a mode I recognized from years of watching her work. Strategic patience, gathering information, looking for the angle. The house felt like a negotiation. Weston Greer's situation had continued to deteriorate. His license renewal had been formally deferred, pending the conflict disclosure resolution. 2 of his firm's major commercial clients had quietly moved their accounts. Not with any announcement, just the kind of gradual withdrawal that happens when word gets around in a professional community that someone's paperwork isn't clean. Arthur had forwarded me a screenshot from a business networking group. A brief, neutral post from one of Greer's former clients thanking their new brokerage for a seamless transition. No names mentioned. No reason given. Everyone who needed to understand it did. I heard from Kurt on a Tuesday evening. He'd been at a lunch where one of the regional real estate journalists had been asking around about the Harwick compliance story. Kurt had said nothing useful and moved on. But the fact that it was circulating told me Greer was trying to get ahead of it, control the narrative before it controlled him. 3 media contacts reached out to me directly over the course of that week. All 3 were looking for a statement, a comment, a source. I declined everyone. My attorney's response was the same to all of them, a single line. Mr. Merritt has no comment at this time and refers all inquiries to Harwick Structural Partners legal office. One of the journalists wrote a short piece anyway about trust structure conflicts in regional commercial real estate. No names. My absence from it was its own kind of statement. Renee noticed. "You've been talking to the press," she said one evening, finding me in the kitchen. "I've been declining the press," I said. "There's a difference." She studied me. "Why? You could be telling your version." "I don't have a version," I said. "I have documents." She looked at me for a long moment, and then something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly, but a kind of reluctant recalibration. Like a woman who had expected one kind of fight and was finding something else entirely. The following Saturday, Arthur and Paige arrived together. Arthur drove. Paige brought groceries because that's what she did. She showed up prepared. I watched them come through the front door together and felt something in my chest that I didn't try to name. Renee was home. She came downstairs when she heard them, and the room held its breath for a second. Arthur nodded at his mother. Not warm, not cold, just measured. Paige looked at her and said, evenly and without flinching, "Mom, I love you. But I need you to know that I know what's been happening. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Renee opened her mouth and closed it again. "I'm not here to fight," Paige continued. "I'm here because Dad matters to me. That's all." She walked past her mother into the kitchen and started putting away groceries. Arthur followed. The conversation was over before Renee had found a word to say. That evening, after Renee had gone upstairs, the three of us sat at the kitchen table and talked. Really talked, for the first time in longer than I could easily measure. Arthur told Paige about the data transfers. Paige told Arthur about the call from Renee and how she'd handled it. They talked around each other at first, then gradually with each other, the old rhythms coming back like muscle memory. At one point, there was a lapse in conversation, and Paige looked across the table at her brother and said, "I'm sorry. About what I said at Christmas 2 years ago. I've been carrying that." Arthur was quiet for a second. Then he said, "I know. Me too." That was it. No big scene. Just two people deciding that the distance between them had cost more than whatever started it. I watched them and said nothing. Sometimes the best thing a father can do is stay out of the way while something repairs itself. We stayed at that table until almost midnight. When they finally went to their old rooms, I sat alone for a while, nursing the last inch of coffee in my cup. Outside, the neighborhood was still and dark. I thought about the week ahead, the legal process, the trust review, the conversation with Bill Crocker I'd scheduled for Monday morning. I thought about Renee upstairs and about the marriage that was ending in the only way it could, not with a single rupture, but with the long, incremental truth-telling that comes when there's nowhere left to hide. I wasn't angry. I hadn't been angry in days. What I felt instead was something simpler and harder to articulate. The particular steadiness of a man who has done what needed doing and can live with every decision he made. The coffee was cold. I poured it out, rinsed the cup, and went to bed. 3 weeks after the Alderton dinner, Weston Greer made the mistake that finished him. It started with a phone call I received on a Tuesday morning from a number I didn't recognize. I let go to voicemail. The message was brief. A man identifying himself as a mutual acquaintance of both Greer and myself, asking if I'd be open to a private conversation to resolve the current situation like gentlemen. I recognized the approach. It was the kind of call someone makes when their attorney has told them the documents are bad, and their only remaining option is a personal appeal. I forwarded the voicemail to Bill Crocker without responding. Bill sent one line back. "Refer all contact to counsel. Do not engage directly." I didn't engage directly. What happened next? Greer brought entirely on himself. Frustrated by the silence, he gave a comment to a regional business journal. A short statement, carefully worded, implying that the Harwick Compliance Review was a retaliatory measure by a legacy trust structure resistant to modern business practices. He didn't name me. He didn't need to. Anyone in the commercial real estate community who read it knew exactly who he was talking about. Bill Crocker called me within an hour of publication. His voice had the particular dry quality it got when something had gone in our favor without requiring any effort on our part. He just made a public statement characterizing our filing as retaliatory. Bill said, "That's actionable." More importantly, it directly contradicts the position his own attorney submitted to the Compliance Board last week, which stated that he had no prior knowledge of the trust's involvement in the lease. Bill paused. A man who had no prior knowledge of something cannot simultaneously claim the filing against him was retaliatory. I let that sit for a moment. What does that mean practically? It means his own words just undermined his legal defense, Bill said. The compliance board has already requested a copy of the article. I expect his license renewal to be denied, not deferred, denied, within the next 2 weeks. It played out almost exactly as Bill predicted. The Regional Real Estate Board issued its decision on a Thursday. License renewal denied, pending a full conduct review. 2 of Greer's remaining commercial partnerships dissolved within days of the announcement. A woman I'd never heard of, a former associate of Greer's from several years prior, contacted Bill's office voluntarily with documentation of a previous conflict disclosure failure in an unrelated transaction. The picture was getting broader than I'd ever intended. I hadn't arranged any of it. Greer had done himself, one bad decision at a time. Kurt called me on a Friday evening, amused in the restrained way he got when something had resolved itself cleanly. 3 journalists contacted me this week asking about you, he said. All 3 wanted to know how you pulled this off. I told them I had no idea what they were talking about. That's the right answer, I said. One of them is writing a piece anyway. Kurt continued. About trust structure conflicts in the commercial leasing market. No names, but it's clearly your situation. The angle is that the whole thing was set in motion by a public comment at a dinner party. He paused. Roger, do you understand that your silence has become the story? I did understand. In a world where everyone talked, the man who said nothing and let the document speak had become, somehow, the most interesting person in the room. I hadn't planned it that way. I'd just done what my father taught me. Keep your name clean, keep your paperwork cleaner, and let the process do the heavy lifting. That weekend, I drove across town on a Saturday morning and sat in the parking lot of Renee's company building for about 10 minutes. Not from sentiment. I'd moved past sentiment somewhere around week 2, just to look at it. The building was solid and well-maintained, occupying a corner lot in the professional district that had appreciated considerably since the lease was first structured. Harwick's name was nowhere visible on the exterior. It never had been. That's how the trust worked. I drove home without going in. That evening, Arthur called to tell me he'd accepted a job offer in the city, a senior position with a cybersecurity firm 2 miles from the Merritt Holdings office. He'd been weighing it for months, hadn't mentioned it until the decision was made. That was Arthur. He processed privately and presented conclusions. You'll be nearby, I said. That's part of it, he said. Then, after a moment, Paige and I are thinking about Thanksgiving together. The 3 of us. Whatever that looks like. I told him whatever it looked like would be fine by me. After I hung up, I sat in the old office under the green lamp for a long while. The blue folder was closed on the desk in front of me. The process was nearly complete, the compliance review, the trust confirmation, the documentation. All of it moving through its channels the way it was designed to, quietly and without drama. Outside, the city hummed. I thought about Renee and about 22 years and about the particular human capacity for building things you don't bother to understand. I didn't feel victorious. I felt something quieter and more permanent. The kind of settled clarity that comes when you've done the right thing at every step and can account for each one. That was enough to sleep on. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in March, 9 months after the Alderton dinner. No courtroom drama, no contested hearing, just paperwork, reviewed and signed, processed through channels that had been constructed carefully enough that there was very little left to argue about. Renee's attorney had made several aggressive moves in the early weeks, then gradually moderated as the documentation mounted. By the end, the settlement reflected what the documents had always said. The Harwick Trust structure remained intact. The IP assignment stood, and Renee's company underwent a formal restructuring under new management. She retained a minority stake in the reorganized entity. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't what she'd imagined she had. Weston Greer's license was formally revoked in February. His firm dissolved quietly in early spring. I heard through Kurt that he'd relocated to another state to start over. I didn't follow the story further. It wasn't mine to follow. Walt Odom sent a handwritten note after the settlement was confirmed. 2 sentences, handled with integrity from start to finish. Your grandfather would have recognized you. I put in the blue folder, which I then put on the top shelf of the bookcase where it could stay without demanding anything. The following November, there was a gala at the Alderton Club, an annual industry event I'd attended for years and skipped only once the previous year when it felt like too much noise. This year I went, not to make a statement, just because it was time. I arrived with Arthur on my left and Paige on my right. Paige wore a deep green dress. Arthur had finally gotten a decent haircut. We walked into that room together. The same room where 12 months earlier I'd quietly pushed back a chair and buttoned my blazer and walked out alone, and I felt the air in the room adjust slightly, the way air does when something has been resolved and everyone knows it without saying so. Kurt found us within 5 minutes. He shook my hand, and then shook Arthur's, and then, characteristically, gave Paige a brief hug and told her she looked like she owned the place. She told him she was working on it. We made the rounds. I spoke to colleagues, nodded to acquaintances, deflected a few well-meaning questions about the past year with answers that were honest and brief. No one asked directly about Renee or Greer. No one needed to. The industry had processed what had happened the way it processes most things, through inference and shared understanding and the quiet repositioning of relationships. At one point during the evening, Franklin appeared at my elbow. He was in a dark suit, impeccable as always, with the expression of a man who has made his peace with something difficult and is moving forward with his dignity intact. He shook my hand. Then he shook Arthur's. Then he looked at Paige for a moment and said, "Your grandmother would have liked how you turned out." Paige blinked. "Thank you, Grandpa," she said. It came out softer than she probably intended. Franklin nodded once, patted my shoulder, and moved on. That was Franklin. No speeches, just precision. Later in the evening, I stepped outside onto the terrace for a few minutes of quiet. The city spread out below in its usual indifferent brightness. Somewhere in it, the wheels of the Harwick Trust were turning in their ordinary, unglamorous way, generating returns, maintaining properties, doing the slow, structural work that nobody photographs or posts about, but that outlasts almost everything that gets attention. I thought about the folder, about the clause on page 9, about a dinner party that had set something in motion that had already been fully in motion before anyone sat down. Paige found me on the terrace after a few minutes. She stood next to me and looked out at the city. "You okay?" she asked. "Better than okay," I said. She took my arm the way she used to when she was a little girl, and we'd stand outside at night looking at stars. She didn't say anything else. Neither did I. We stood there until Arthur came out to find us, told us the speeches were starting, and herded us back inside with the comfortable authority of a man who had found his footing. The three of us walked back into the room together.